Don't leave me, girl. Please stay with me tonight. I don't know. That song has been stuck in my head like all day and all night. Hey y'all, welcome back to Bookish Rome. I'm here with another video. So today we're gonna be talking a little bit about the 100 books I want you to read before you die. Okay, now you're probably like, Ashley, you've already done this list like 2 times before. I know, I do this list once a year. Okay, so listen, I read enough books every single year that this list cannot be a standing list. I feel like this list is going to have to change every year based off of things that I have read in the previous year. So here's the catch to this. 2 things. 1, you're probably going to see duplicates, which is fine because you may be a new viewer. And in that case, you know what? More power to you. You're getting some book recommendations. 2, if you're an old viewer, guess what? You may be reminded of some stuff that you added to your TBR because you've watched this video before and you still haven't picked it up. So this is just like a gentle nudge. I should have said 3 things. 3 things. As you can see from the title of this video, I changed the format of this video. Typically, I do all 100 books in one video. What I found in doing that is that I've had to speak so quickly about these books in such simplistic terms that they each get like 15-20 seconds, and that still puts me at a 45-minute, hour-long video. I figured that if I split this video up into 10 parts, 1, it'll allow this to be a moving and ever-growing, ever-changing documentation that will stick within this year of reading, and I will be able to talk about the books in a more well-defined manner. So we're gonna do 10 at a time. I think the first time I ever did this list, I actually ended up leaving out like 20 books, which is amazing. Another caveat. One thing that I don't like about lists is when people create these lists and they have duplicates of authors. I'm going to try my hardest not to duplicate any authors. I'm going to make sure that before I make the second grouping of this, that I am not duplicating anyone's work. I also would like to point out that this is not in any particular order. This is not 100 being the least and 1 being the most, or 1 being the least, 100 being the most, whatever. This is not in any particular order. This is just 100 books that I've read, that I constantly think about, that I have read because some of these books I have read multiple times, and ones that I think are essential to everyone's reading experience. I should have said, I said 2 things, now I'm about to hit like the daggone 5th thing. And that sounded very, very country. Next thing, I read a wide variety of genre and a wide variety of age category. That means that everything in this video is not going to be for you if you are a very specific type of reader. I cannot promise you that everything is going to fit into your reading sphere because I read very, very widely. So you are going to see picture book representation on this. You are going to see middle grade. You're going to see children. You're going to see graphic novels. You're going to see a little bit of everything on this list. And I like that because it makes me feel like there's something on this list for everyone. Regardless of what type of reader you are, what genres you really like, there's going to be something on here that possibly could work for you. And I've never been able to put myself into a box in terms of content of what I read, whether that's age category or genre. I never have been able to do that. So I start now. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to start with, and ironically, I own most of the first group that I'll be discussing. So we're going to go ahead and start off with a banger here. One that I highly, highly recommend, and that is The Dark 30, Southern Tales of the Supernatural by Patricia McKissick. And this was illustrated by Brian Pickney. This was the 1993? I feel like this was a 1993 Newbery Honor, and 93 winner of the Coretta Scott King Award, but don't hold it to me, but it is the early 90s in which I know that this book was awarded, because this book was published in 1992. This obviously is a reprint. I read this book for the first time last year for Blackwing. I was familiar with the book. I had heard of the book because I'm familiar with Patricia McKissick, who is a pioneer in children's literature, especially a pioneer when we're talking about influential people in Black children's literature. And I had been meaning to pick this up for a while. I just never got to it. And Bree was kind enough to allow me to choose the group read for Ruby's Crew last year. And we ended up coming to a consensus, and this was the book that we went through, or we went with. And when I tell you phenomenal book, it is separated into several different stories, and I believe that there are 10 stories. Yes, so there's 10 stories. The 10 stories are The Legend of Pine Oak, We Organize Justice, The 1159, The Sight, The Woman in the Snow, The Conjure Brother, Boo Mama, The Genji, and The Chicken Coop Monster. These books, which I did not, these stories, which I did not know, are set during single decades in history, specifically looking at Black history. And I believe that in the first one, we are starting in 1868. Or the 1800s, something along those lines. And so as we keep going through decades until we get up to the point that we're in the 80s or the 90s, which I thought was really interesting. But these stories are not only like horror, spooky tales that a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, I'm surprised that this is considered children's work, but it is a part of Black history. It showcases Black history, monumental events and moments in Black history, Black culture. And it was just a very, very rewarding experience. Patricia McKissick is a gifted writer. The ability to craft such suspense, to also educate you at the same time while being, entertained, I think is a gift that not all writers have. And I really appreciated what she did with this. And Brian Pickney's illustrations, let me see if I can find one. He does a lot of like scratch work with his illustrations, but they really capture this, I don't know how to describe the feeling. It's like dark. And a lot of these stories came from telling what Patricia McKissick's experience, like sitting on her grandmother's porch, and this time between like right before you hit dusk, that's why it's called Southern Tales of the Supernatural, the Dark 30s, like right before it gets dark. And they would sit around and they would tell these stories, these spine-chilling ghost tales, while she was shelling peas, while she was getting greens ready. So there's a lot of culture just tied to this book alone that I really, really appreciated. And I'm glad that we ended up reading it for Blackwing. And this is one that I think I want to reread and annotate and revisit. But oh my gosh, I could not make this list without including this. Now, the next one that I have on this list is going to be James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain. Last year, I read a series of James Baldwin books and fell in love with everything that this man does. Pen to paper, he's just untouchable. And I think that I do need to go back and revisit the rest of his stuff. But my goodness, it was just so beautifully crafted and so beautifully done. I specifically went with Go Tell It on the Mountain because this was the first one, like when I was just thinking about it, this is the first one that popped into my head. But to be quite honest, anything by James Baldwin should be included on this list. Because I'm trying hard not to do duplicates, I specifically went with this one. This one is semi-autobiographical, follows a young boy who's kind of reckoning with the fact of being a son of a preacher while also thinking about his identity, his sexuality. It was so good. I mean, this kind of reckoning with like spirituality and how it can be in conflict with your identity, and knowing that that was like the experience of James Baldwin, and he was a preacher, and he was a gay Black man living in the South, and having to deal with the racism and the bigotry, not only just because of his skin color, but also his sexuality. It was just a lot of different elements combined in this that I thought just made it absolutely exceptional. But like I said, you really can go with any James Baldwin. Any James Baldwin will work on here. This is just the one that I happen to like. When I was thinking, I was like, I gotta put James Baldwin on this list. This was the first one that popped into me. And this wasn't even the last one that we read. The last one that we ended up reading, what was the last? I can't even remember the last one that we ended. I know Go Tell It on the Mountain was not, because we were reading them by publication date. And this was not the last one that we ended up reading. So, you know, this was just one that popped into my head. I do own a copy of this one, but my goodness gracious, y'all, if you ever get the opportunity to read anything by Baldwin, I promise you it's going to be a phenomenal experience. Everything from his speeches to the letters to his fiction. You'll enjoy it. I have never encountered an author that I have fallen in love with so quickly and have wanted to consume so much of their backlist, when originally I felt like I was very intimidated by James Baldwin, and I didn't think that I had the intellect to be able to process anything that he would be discussing. But I think everything is written in such an accessible way, and just the connections that you can make specifically from this book, the connections you can make from the main character's experiences in this book to James Baldwin's own personal experiences is just phenomenal. So I say Go Tell It on the Mountain, but inevitably I mean anything by James Baldwin. The next one I have on this list, y'all you genuinely should not be surprised about this one, because I did an entire reading vlog on this one last year, because it was a reread for me. I had read it 10 years prior to my reread last year, and it made me intimidated to pick up anything else by Toni Morrison, but but I wanted to give it a try again. It's one of the most banned books that I've ever encountered. It's been on the list, the top list of banned and challenge books on ALA for a while. I think the past couple of years I was shocked that it hadn't made the list a couple of times, but it is Morrison's first work, and one that she inevitably did not end up liking that much, but it is The Bluest Eye. I think that, once again, Toni Morrison is one of those authors where technically, and I can't recommend because I haven't read more of her bibliography, but I've read another one today. Not today. I didn't read it today. I read it twice. 2.5 times actually. Recitative, and I always butcher that name, but honestly, like James Baldwin, anything by Toni Morrison. Pick up anything by Toni Morrison and I feel like you just can't necessarily go wrong. But I specifically chose Bluest Eye. This is one that I have read, not even really read the most, because Recitative I've read 2.5 times, but I read that in like one sitting. This one I think had more of the emotional impact on it. Recitative really made me, they both made me think, but that was a completely different level of trying to figure out what is what. Like that social experience, like only something Toni Morrison could do. But this was, and this is, I will say, not for the faint of heart. I think that it was a lot for me to take in the first time. It was a lot for me to take in the second time. It takes place in Lorain, Ohio, which is where Toni Morrison grew up. And it follows a town of people. And it's interesting because we are following 2 young girls at first, and they encounter a 3rd young girl who has a horrible living experience with her family. And it is tragic and trauma-filled, and she wants to have these blue eyes. And so a lot of it too is perception of identity, treatment of Black women, treatment of darker skinned Black women, this need to have proximity to whiteness, the plight, the experience of Black people post Reconstruction. And so there's a lot of elements that are in this book, and a lot of trauma that is packed into this book, and it is not an easy read. Toni Morrison, from what I know, actually did not like this book that much. So I think it's about time that I move on to something else. But I think everyone should read this book at least once in their lifetime. Like, I don't think you should go on in your reading experience, especially if you're a big fan of like literary fiction. You should read this book at least once. I think that this is one that you should come across. Let's see. The next one that I have is going to be one of our 2 graphic novels that I've included in this first 10. And it is one that I do an annual read of every year. I haven't read it this year. I will get to it at some point this year. I don't know when, but I am going to get to it this year. It is one that I talk about, that I praise, that I adore, that I absolutely love, that is just... I don't have enough words to describe this book. But it is Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. I believe that she just came out with a newer one, but I think it was a group effort, and I'll have to check that one out. I haven't read it yet, but I experienced Persepolis, and I know I talk about this book a lot, and I'm going to continue to talk about this book a lot because it is a very powerful and meaningful book. But I encountered it for the first time my senior year of high school. There was a guy that I knew who had come across the adaptation of Persepolis, and I forget I don't even think we were at his house. I can't remember, but it's ironic I can remember his name. Remember, he looks like the whole nine, and I mean, like, I've been out of high school now for a very long time. But he introduced, it was us and a group of other people, and he introduced us to the film adaptation of Persepolis. And I will never forget, like, my experience watching that. Because it was film in French, and of course we were watching it with subtitles, I think, because all of us at that time actually were in, I can't remember if we were in our regular French class or if we had all moved up to IB French at that time, but either way, we were watching the film, and I just remember having this powerful reaction to it, and I really, really just enjoyed it. Now, watching the film, I had no idea that there was a graphic novel adaptation or a graphic novel attached to it, and that was an adaptation. I had no clue. Ironically, my freshman year of high school, freshman year of college, we all had to do this group read. And it was a freshman class read where, I don't know if every university still does that, where incoming freshmen all end up reading the same book. And then when you take, like, your university 101 class, like, you're discussing the book that you're reading together as an entire graduating class, which I thought, you know, interesting concept. Don't know if that's something that's still done, but they picked Persepolis, and I was shocked. I was shook because I was like, really? And at that time, I didn't have much experience with graphic novels. I knew of them and stuff like that, but I mean, would I consider myself an avid graphic novel reader? Absolutely not. But I read it, and I was in love. And I've been reading this book since my freshman year of college, and I graduated college 10 years ago. That's so disgusting to say. I'm so old. But no, I graduated with my bachelor's degree 10 years ago. Over 10 years now, it's 11. And I have always come back to this book. I've always come, so there's kind of an emotional and developmental kind of like attachment to this, but this is one of the best graphic memoirs that I have ever read in my life. It genuinely is. It is one of the best of all time. And it is about Marjane Satrapi's experience growing up during the Iranian Revolution in the 70s, I believe. And so watching the whole entire dynamic of her country, Iran, just kind of change, and understanding that in context of people's perceptions of Iran, especially coming from the Western world, especially as someone who lives in the US, and it kind of and I'm not going to say kind of, it's kind of like the propaganda that gets pushed out about Iran and Iranian people, and our perceptions of Iranian people is just disgusting. And so hearing this from the perspective of someone who is Iranian, who does address the issues, but addresses the issues in a historical context that holds all parties responsible. Because what is very interesting is that the West will have these perceptions, specifically of countries in the Middle East, and pretend like they had nothing to do with it. They feel like, oh my gosh, like, this place is horrible. Don't know how they got like that. And colonialism and imperialism does it every single time, okay? And she beautifully captures the impact that the Western world had on Iran and how it helped change the face of Iran. And so it's interesting getting that historical bit tied into her own personal experiences and the impact that it had on her family emotionally, the devastation that it caused and the restrictions that ended up happening, how it was detrimental to her as a blossoming young woman, and having to go overseas and being Iranian and going to a Western country to study abroad and to get an education, and how people viewed her and how difficult it was for her to transition to being and missing home and not necessarily being able to go home because for safety purposes. So there's so many levels to this. And I never, ever, 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 I have never tabbed a graphic novel. Never have tabbed a graphic novel. But I tabbed and put in sticky notes, like little, these little sticky notes here, and wrote notes on the sticky notes, because of course I was not going to write a graphic novel. That's a no-no. That's an absolute no-no. But I did so much just deep diving, and I feel like I get something new every time I read Persepolis. And I can't tell you, I mean, granted, I probably have it documented on Goodreads as having been read like 3 or 4 times, and I've read it in all types of formats. I've read it in this complete Persepolis. I've read it in the individual format. So this is one of those books where I just keep going back to it and back to it and back to it and back to it. And if you want a good lesson in history, you want a good coming of age story, a very good family saga, pick this book up. Pick this book up. Read it at least once. If there's any graphic memoir that you're going to pick up in your lifetime, please make it this. Make it this. All right, so the next one that I have on my list is one that I think I've read 2 or 3 times. And this one is a young adult historical fiction by an author that I really enjoy. And I've read a couple of her books now, and every time I read her books, she just blows me away. There are a couple people who've picked up her books on my recommendation, and I'm happy that they've done so. And they have enjoyed her stuff, and I need to make my way through her backlist. But the one that I always go back to, and the one that I really, really appreciate and really, really adore, is Salt to the Sea by Ruta Sepetys. I have a whole Ruta Sepetys collection up there with my young adult historical fiction. This book is, I don't even know the words to describe this, because the emotional piece tied to this is gut-wrenching. I think that when we talk about maritime disasters, people often, you know, say, okay, what is the biggest maritime disaster that you could think of? People are going to say Titanic, because that is the one that is the most discussed. That is the one that has been adapted the most. It's the one that we see in literature the most. And this one doesn't. This talks about the actual biggest maritime disaster in history. This is about, and I want to make sure that I get the name of the ship right, okay? It is the Wilhelm Gustloff, which is the deadliest disaster in maritime history. Like I said, most people will either go to Titanic or the Lusitania. Those are the two that I think are like very, very prominent in people's minds. But Ruta Sepetys went a little bit deeper and decided to dive into Wilhelm Gustloff, and the death toll from that surpassed both of those. I think it was like estimates of like 9,000 people ended up dying. I think what else makes this super unique is that this is a World War II historical fiction book, right? And I criticize young adult and middle grade for this, is that when it comes to historical fiction, they're getting better. But as age groups, World War II is like the biggest area that is covered when we're talking about historical fiction. If you want to find historical fiction, you're going to find a plethora of books that are specifically about World War II. I mean, both age groups. There's no balance to the amount of content that you would find about World War II. This is World War II, but what I liked, it was World War II from a completely different perspective. Instead of thinking about, when we're talking about the Allied powers and the Axis powers, so mainly when I think about World War II historical fiction, it usually takes place in France, England, Germany, US. In these two age groups, that's where the world, like those are the heavy hitters, that's where they take place, or Poland. This is Lithuania, and I don't think that we see that a lot in young adult fiction. And so to take a time in history that people are seemingly most comfortable with, but focusing it on the actual biggest maritime disaster in history, talking about that, which is not often discussed because it's overshadowed by those two other tragic incidents, and then setting it in a country that people are not often covering, especially when we talk about World War II history from a US standpoint. You don't hear about Lithuania and the impact that World War II had, the conflict, that the way that they were torn between the Germans and the Russians and how that impacted them. You don't really hear much of that at all. So she created or crafted such a different novel than what I think I was anticipating the first time that I read this, because I've read it two or three times at this point. But also, the formatting of this is told from multiple different perspectives. And that is not an easy thing to do, especially because you are dedicating your book to multiple characters, and they have their own perspectives, which means that your development has to be very, very good. I'm very, very specific about books that are told in dual POV or more, because you have to be able to craft these characters three-dimensional. They have to be fleshed out in a way that your readers are going to want to connect with them. And she did 4. And it was so well done. Super tragic, but very, very well done in introducing younger readers to a part of history that is not often covered. That's why this is on this list. Not just because it's a beautifully written book and because I had an emotional kind of connection to it, but I think if I'm talking about like uniqueness for this audience, because I'm sure there are plenty of books that exist in adult range, but if I'm talking about uniqueness and what's available to this group, ages 12 to 18, a teenage audience, I specifically had to put this on this list because I feel like it covers a part of history that age group is not going to learn, especially here in the US. They're not going to learn in a secondary classroom. So I really, really appreciated the uniqueness of this, the history of it. I felt very educated walking away from this. Educated in the sense that I learned something. I was able to gain something more about history. And I could be slightly biased because I am a history major, or I was a history major in undergrad. So there's also that. And I feel like, dang, a history major and I didn't even know this. So there's also that bias that plays into it. I'm good for admitting and understanding my own biases here. But I appreciated this book. I think, like I said, well crafted, well written, uniqueness of topic. But once again, Ruta Sepetys is another author who has a lot of historical fiction that covers parts of history that are not often talked about or taught in secondary school, available for a teen audience. So I say salt to the sea because this is the one that I'm most familiar with, although I have read her other book. That was also a 5-star read for me, and I can't call the name, but I will put the picture on the screen right here. You can go with anything Ruta Sepetys. I don't think you're going to miss with her at all. I can't say that for sure because I haven't read her entire backlist, but both of the books that I have read by her have been 5-star reads. All right, y'all, we are making our way through our list. This is one that I do not own physically, and I am shocked that I do not own this book physically because I think I did at one point and I don't know what happened. But this was one that Bria and I actually ended up covering for one of our Realma Comics Book Club picks, and we ended up reading March volumes 1 through 3 and Run. I just put March on here, like the entire March series, but I would say that you should read, well, I just put March, but you should read volumes 1 through 3 and Run because it gives you a very great broad perspective of John Lewis, his life growing up, the work that he did, how he was connected to the civil rights movement, all the people that he knew. And I think that at least in our country, we've done a good job recently of acknowledging all of the work, especially after he passed away. Acknowledging all of the wonderful things that he's done for the United States and all the things he's done for the Black community. But my goodness, there's so much history woven into these. They were so beautifully crafted, black and white, a history lesson all wrapped into one. And I think that it is such a good look at the civil rights movement. It is a good educational piece on the civil rights movement in a medium that I think creates a different level of accessibility. I remember being in grade school and having to watch Eyes on the Prize. I don't know if y'all have ever watched that PBS production where they talk in depth, I mean like super, super detail about the civil rights movement. And it's not that it wasn't enjoyable, because I learned a lot from watching that, but then I think of something like March, which provides a different level of accessibility for people who are interested in learning more about the civil rights movements and are more visual, or want to read something but need something like more visual. And I think that a comic, a graphic novel is a great way to do that, and to get this from the perspective of a man who was there front and center, who was pivotal to the civil rights movement. This was such a bomb-ass choice for John Lewis to do. Like, I'm so blown away that he decided to go with a comic format, honestly, with like the lack of respect of the time that this was coming out, and still even today, kind of the lack of respect that a lot of comics and graphic novels end up getting, and he chose to go with this specific medium. I think that that was just smart. But the intricacy with which this one is written, the artwork, the experiences that he goes through, his interactions with some of the most well-known and prominent civil rights leaders, up until the point where we start to see kind of it break apart, especially after the death of Martin Luther King Jr., that the factions that kind of exist post his death. And I think in Run is where we really, really get to see more of that development of the Black Panther Party, and even John Lewis's first interactions with the then would-be leaders of the Black Panther Party, and like his perceptions of what their initiatives and goals were, and how he, you know, being such a huge part of SNCC and getting ousted. And so there's such a level of complexity to the storytelling in this one, and I'm glad that he made the choice to do this and we were able to get it from him before he died, because, you know, it's important to get the stories from those who live these experiences before they're no longer with us. And so we were able to get 4 graphic novels of this specific part of history before he passed away, and I really loved it. I think that March is probably one of the most recommended books for teens who have to read or learn more about history. I know that this gets pushed a lot, but I just feel like in terms of putting it on this list, it is one of the most iconic graphic novels to this date. Now, of course, people are going to argue with me about some of the greatest, like Watchmen, V for Vendetta, like all of that. Like, listen, I get you. I get it. And we will get there. I promise you, we will get there. But I think that if I'm thinking about comics and graphic novels that deserve a place on this list, there is no way that I could not include March. I do not put Persepolis, because I know I said Persepolis is one of the best nonfiction, or one of the best graphic memoirs that I've ever read in my life. March is also a graphic memoir, but there's so much history tied into it that it kind of like toes that line between like nonfiction and then, you know, a memoir, history. So it's just so many things combined into one. But I also just felt like deep in my soul, I could not make this list without including March. The next one that I'm going to include is this one's interesting because I feel like it technically could be middle grade, but I also think that it could be for a younger YA audience because of the content. And this is a stock book. It is a highly awarded book. I read this book the first time in 2020. I actually need to do a reread because it's been a while since I've read it. 2020 was the last time that I read this book. But I feel like every time I do this list, I have to include this book because, my God. And that is Genesis Begins Again by Alicia D. Williams. As you can see, when I'm talking about the conflict between age category, this received the William C. Morris debut, which is actually a YA award, and also the Newbery Honor, which is a children's award. So, and then the Coretta Scott King John Steptoe for New Talent. So there's a lot of, this can fit in multiple age categories, and I think that it does just a great job of storytelling. So we are following a little girl by the name of Genesis who has huge issues going in her family. I mean, like very very huge issues going on in her family. There are a host of content warnings for this one. Her father is dealing with addiction to gambling and has alcoholism. There's content warnings in this for colorism, for texturism. And we are dealing with a dark-skinned Black girl in a family that is colorist, is texturist, and doesn't really adequately prepare her to deal with the outside world because they break her down in the family, and so she can't manage outside the family. Broke my heart in so many different places. This speaks to the legacy, the impact of what happens when we as a Black community are trained to seek that proximity to whiteness once again. So kind of thematically looking at some of the things that we see in The Bluest Eye, we also see in Genesis Begins Again, because we see a young dark-skinned Black girl who's dealing with wanting her hair not to be as kinky and coily, not wanting to have dark skin, wanting to be lighter, wanting her hair to be a certain way, and having a grandmother in the household that kind of reinforces those negative thoughts, those negative behaviors that come with that. And it's sad, but at the same time, you know, I think Alicia writes in a way that we do get some healing, some feelings of hope tied into this. But I think the main thing that I took out of this, and what I thought was very, very interesting to do and very impactful to do in a book that is targeted at a younger audience as opposed to The Bluest Eye, is very much so adult. This book really does talk or speak to that legacy and how we as a Black community have to be very careful and how we continue to foster that negative attitude about the way that we look, the way that we've been taught. Laws have been put into place to force us into having that proximity to whiteness, you know, from hair covering laws to going into the workplace at one point where locks were not an appropriate hairstyle. And still, I mean, having the Crown Act, where who you are and the way in which you exist is a legacy of slavery and racism, and not wanting to feed into, not buying into that narrative and not passing it on generation to generation. I thought that that was kind of like a complex point to put into a narrative, but creating it in a way that it was accessible and understandable for a younger audience, because it is something that our youth do battle with. I mean, if you think about the Crown Act, still in the past year or so, we've had kids who've had to cut their hair in order to graduate because they've had locks, or, you know, you have teachers who are messing with children's hair because they don't deem it appropriate or acceptable. So it's not that this has ended. It's not that the legacy has ended and this is in some way some historical fiction. This is very much so realistic fiction. And I think that kids need to be exposed to it, whether this is something that, you know, our Black kids are experiencing, or it's something that someone who doesn't have the Black experience as a kid is reading about and understanding why Black hair, why Black skin, the importance of it in light of racism, in light of slavery, like how people have to navigate through society with those things still very much so ingrained in that same society. It's powerful. I could talk about this book for ages, y'all, but once again, the uniqueness of this book, and the power with which Alicia wrote this book, I never not put this book on this list, because if there is a book that I think does a great job of talking about those things, bringing up these isms that a lot of Black children experience, especially our dark-skinned Black children, this is it. All right. This is why I wanted to do 10 at a time, because I can talk more, and you can see I'm going to speed it up though. I'm going to speed it up. Okay. So, the next one that I want to talk about is Long Way Down by Jason Reynolds. Once again, Jason Reynolds is one of those authors who you can put anything by him on this list. And I've read a host of things by Jason Reynolds, from his young adult stuff to his children's stuff. I literally have read a great deal of things from him. I read his first picture book last year. This is the book that I chose because I was going back and forth between Long Way Down and then the one that he did with Brendan, and I can't even remember why, and I could see the cover, All American Boys. I was debating between both of these. I own both. I've read both of them multiple times, but this is the one that has stuck with me the most, and the one that I think is very interesting because it is about a young boy who is close to being caught up in this cycle of violence, right? Where his brother ends up killed because of something that his brother did. And so he has to make this decision on whether he is going to continue that cycle of violence or whether he is going to break free from it. And Jason Reynolds ended up spending a lot of time with kids that were incarcerated and learned a lot about how these kids get labeled and put into situations where they're deemed bad for society. They're isolated, they're ostracized, and once they're in the system, they are on that path to stay in the system into adulthood. That's the way that it usually tracks for most of these kids. And a lot of times, and when I heard him speak about this book specifically, he was talking about how a lot of people don't realize that it is a cycle that these kids are stuck in. And these kids have dreams and ambitions and goals just like any other kid. But when you grow up in a certain environment, you're taught certain things. When you are introduced to a cycle and you're stuck in it, that's how your mind works. And these are kids, your brain is not even developed. Okay. We're incarcerating kids that are 13, 14 years old. They haven't reached full development. Your brain doesn't develop until your mid-20s. And so, especially when we're talking about the development of the frontal cortex, or frontal lobe, whatever it is. I didn't major in psychology, but you get what I'm saying. That reasoning, that ability to make decisions in the front of your brain is not fully developed. And he talked about all of that when he was giving his speech, but this sticks with me the most because it's one of those open-ended books where you don't know what happens at the end. And he literally is taking an elevator down. And when he's on this elevator, he's encountering different people. And I think time is a funny thing in this. And I've read this book like 2 times. And at some point, I'm going to figure this book out. I promise you, I'm going to figure this book out. But it is one, as you can see, I was in the middle of another reread. But this is another stacked one. This won the Walter D. Myers Award, Newbery Honor book. This is a Pulitzer Prize book. It's a Coretta Scott King book. It is also one of those two that's kind of caught in between where it won a Newbery, but it also is a young adult book. It's very it's very interesting, but I love this book. I love this book so much. This book has a lot of meaning to me, but like I said, anything by Jason Reynolds you can pick up and add to this. Anything, in this place. As an author, he just needs to have a slot on this list. I would not make this list without including Jason Reynolds. All right, y'all, this is gonna be the last graphic novel that I have on my list, but I could not include this. This is one of the best continuing comic series that I've ever read out of Image. It has one of the best teams that I have ever seen, and it is this is a fictional one that is horror, but encompasses so much Black history into it. And that is Bitterroot, which was created by David F. Walker, Chuck Brown, and Sanford Green, which I've had the pleasure of spending some time with Mr. Brown. I have read these multiple times as well. This is the Omni. Thank you to Tia for gifting me this Omni a while ago. I have not opened up this Omni. I refuse to read it because it's just absolutely gorgeous and beautiful, and I just don't want to mess up any of the binding. I literally just have it on display. But Bitterroot follows this family that is combating the old family that has these abilities, very much so feels like hoodoo abilities, and they deal with these entities that are evil. Now, there is a complexity to this evilness. It's very much so rooted in the history of racism, hatred of Black folk, and it is when you have white folk that engage in these horrific things against Black folk, and they turn into these creatures that attempt to do even further damage. But it gets more complex because then you have these Black people who carry the pain and the trauma of the Black experience, and they too change into these creatures. And so it's very interesting to see this dichotomy of of how do Black people deal with the generational trauma, the trauma that we pass from one generation to the next. How do we deal with that burden? How do we let that burden transform us? How do we deal with that pain? Does it also turn us into something that is unrecognizable and violent and evil? Or do we find other ways to manage and deal with it? There's also some other groups in this that I thought was very interesting. Of course, in the time period, there's specifically an Asian family that they work with. I think they were trying to bring in the history of Chinese exclusionism. I don't even know if that's a word, but you think about the Chinese Exclusion Act, the way Japanese people were treated, especially we're thinking like post World War II. Or during World War II and post World War II. So there's just a lot of history tied into this as well. A lot of Black culture tied into this. This book has won the Eisner twice in 2020 and won the Eisner in 2022. I cannot praise this enough. It's on hiatus. I don't know if the three of them are ever going to continue the series, but Lord willing, they will. I really hope they do, because once again, this is one of those books where you don't just get, you hear it cracking. That's why I don't want to open it. That's why I didn't want to open it. You don't just get the comic, but you also get these, kind of like these essays about, Black culture. So one of these is like Deep Roots, Rich Soil, Race, Horror, and the Ethnogothic, where they're talking about this cultural phenomenon of things like Octavia E. Butler's Kindred, or films like Candyman or Get Out, and when they have like realistic elements and they also fall into the horror genre, like how do we view those things? Like, are they Afrofuturistic? And so what John Jennings is saying, and this is the person that specifically wrote this essay, was talking about how him and Stanford, they coined the term called ethnogothic, because they saw that the mere conventions were limiting in how they were able to describe these horrific elements that had some reality to them. So you think about things like Get Out, where, yeah, it's a horror, but there's some truth behind that. When you think about things like Kindred, there's some, you know, this horrific elements to it, but there's truth in it. And it's the same thing here in Bitterroot, where it's horror, but at the same time, it's not like it's this made up horror. Like, this is a horror that Black people truly do experience. And I just, oh man, I can't hold that book anymore because it's too heavy, but I could talk about that for ages as well. But I could not make this list. I don't know if I've ever included Bitterroot before, but I'm telling you now, I had to include Bitterroot because there's no way I wasn't going to include Bitterroot. Okay, so the last one that I'm going to include is going to be a picture book. And it is Freedom in Congo Square. And I don't own a copy of it, but when I need to get a copy of this because I don't own a copy of it. But it's Freedom in Congo Square by Carol Boston Weatherford, who does so much, y'all. I've read so much by Carol Boston. She, first of all, she's got to come out with like 3 or 4 picture books a year at this point. And she does a lot of narrative nonfiction for kids. But it is Carol Boston Weatherford as the author and R. Gregory Christie as the illustrator. Now this won the Coretta Scott King Award as well as, or Coretta Scott King Honor, as well as the Caldecott Honor, I believe in I always get my dates wrong with these awards, y'all, because I always get confused. I believe it would have been in 2017, but it was for the 2016 year, if that makes sense, because the awards are always announced the next year, the following year of the publication date, but it was published in 2016. This is such a great book where the artwork was not only dynamic, but once again, I think that a lot of, which you're going to notice a pattern. I'm interrupting myself, but you're going to notice a pattern in how I do these lists. So what you're going to see in all of these lists is that I feel like I recommend the things the most that I feel like I'm gaining some knowledge from. I'm learning about an experience that may be my own or someone else's experience, but there is some knowledge being gained from that. Not saying that people can't read for pure entertainment. I'm not here to have that, you know, I'm not finna tussle about that today. But once again, I had to put this on this list, and there will be other picture books on this list, plenty of picture books. But I wanted to include this one because it stood out to me as one of my favorite Carol Boston Weatherford books. Once again, this is another author that literally you could just have on this list. If you're not interested in this specific title, anything by Carol Boston Weatherford, she just needed to be on this list. And Freedom in Congo Square is one of my favorite ones that she's done. And except for her Toni Morrison one that she just did this year, that one was actually really good too. That one was really, really, really good. But this one specifically looks at a little unknown history of America, Black history. And it's about this square, Congo Square, which is in New Orleans, where free Blacks and slaves would congregate once a week. It was the one place where they were able to meet and kind of intermingle with each other. I think one of the interesting ways that this book was kind of developed is that we see the struggles of the slaves from, you know, each day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, up until that Sunday when they had that freedom. They were able to have that day where they could express themselves, where they could enjoy the company of others, where they could dance, they can communicate. You know, it's different. It's not an experience that they were able to get, and to have to look forward to that one specific day. When I think about that as the one day where you were able to kind of be carefree and release and relax and let go, and every other day of the week was just horrible. And you had to just keep up your spirits to make it to that one day. It's gut-wrenching, but it is a part of history that, once again, not taught in secondary, it's not well known, but one that I had joy in learning about, and one that I hope that y'all would be interested in learning about as well. All right, y'all, so those are the first 10 books that I would recommend that you read before you die. I don't know how often I am going to do these lists. I'm thinking that maybe possibly once a week, or it could be every other week, but I will get you the 100 before the year ends. And what we may see is, like, as I read things throughout the rest of this year, they may get incorporated to this list and make it a little different. Pulling some things that I read from the later half of last year after I ended up doing this video. But yeah, if you want to give me a couple of recommendations that you would add to this video, let me know in the comments down below. As always, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see more content from me, click the subscribe button and hit the bell for notifications. And if you're looking for ways to support the channel, all the links will be down in the description box below, and I'll be back with another video soon. Bye.
You're unaware, keep moving like the scars aren't even there. It's in the air like a blazing